The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the polished marble floor, but the warmth of the light didn't seem to reach the far side of the massive living room. Sophie sat on the edge of a cream-colored sofa, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. To anyone else, the room would have looked like a dream. It was perched high above the city, offering a view that most people only saw on postcards or in movies. Glass walls stretched from floor to ceiling, showcasing the sprawling skyline and the tiny, moving cars below. But for Sophie, the silence in the penthouse was heavy. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of silence that happens in a museum, where you are afraid to speak too loudly because you might disturb the air. Everything here was perfect. The white rugs looked like they had never been stepped on. The art on the walls was abstract and expensive, chosen by someone with very good taste but very little heart. There were no family photos on the tables. No coats thrown over chairs. No signs that real people actually lived here. Sophie looked down at her own hands. They were clean, manicured, and trembling slightly. She had only been Mrs. Sterling for 3 weeks. The name felt strange on her tongue, like a word she hadn't learned how to pronounce yet. Her husband, Alexander, was a man who owned half the city. He had built an empire from nothing, and now he lived in this glass castle in the sky. And Sophie was the girl from the small neighborhood who used to teach piano to pay rent. She stood up and walked slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling glass. She pressed her hand against the cool surface. Down there, life was messy and loud. Up here, everything was filtered through climate control and security systems. She felt like a bird that had been captured and put in a golden cage. The cage was beautiful, yes, but it was still a cage. The media certainly thought she was a bird. Since the wedding announcement, the newspapers and gossip sites had been having a field day. They didn't write about Sophie's love for music or the late nights she spent studying in college. They didn't care that she worked 2 jobs to help her sick mother. They only saw the age gap and the bank account. To them, she was a climber. A user. A gold digger. The words didn't hurt her as much as the suspicion in Alexander's eyes. He was kind to her, in a distant sort of way. He opened doors for her and bought her beautiful dresses, but he always watched her. He was waiting, she thought, for the mask to slip. He was waiting for her to demand money or to cause a scene so he could say, "I knew it. I knew she was just like the others." She heard the sound of the elevator. The soft chime echoed through the apartment, making her jump. She turned around just as the main entrance slid open. Alexander walked in. He looked tired. His suit jacket was unbuttoned, and he was loosening his tie. He looked like a man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, even though he had the money to hire 1,000 people to carry it for him. "Hello," he said. His voice was deep and polite, but it lacked the warmth of a greeting between spouses. It sounded more like a boss greeting a new employee. "Hi," Sophie said softly. She smoothed the fabric of her skirt, a nervous habit. "You're home early." Alexander dropped his keys into a glass bowl on a side table. The clink sound was sharp in the quiet room. "I had a meeting cancelled. It's a mess downstairs right now. The merger is falling apart." He walked over to the bar in the corner of the room. He poured himself a drink, ice clinking against the crystal. He didn't offer her one. He didn't ask if she was okay. They lived in the same space, but they were miles apart. "Are you hungry?" Sophie asked, taking a step toward him. "I can ask the chef to start dinner early." Alexander turned around, swirling the liquid in his glass. He looked at her, really looked at her, For a long moment, Sophie felt a chill run down her spine. She knew what was coming. The conversation they had been avoiding since the wedding. "The charity gala is tomorrow night," he said. Sophie nodded. "I know. I picked out the dress you bought. The blue one." Alexander sighed. He walked closer, stopping near the fireplace. "Sophie, my sister is going to be there." "Rebecca." "I know," she said again. Rebecca hadn't come to the wedding. She had sent a card that simply said, "Good luck." "Rebecca is protective," Alexander continued, choosing his words carefully. "And she has a very loud voice in our social circle. She thinks you are, well, she thinks you are only with me for the lifestyle." The words hung in the air between them. Sophie felt a flush of embarrassment rise up her neck. It was humiliating to hear her husband repeat these insults, even if he didn't believe them himself. "And what do you think?" Sophie asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alexander looked away, staring at the unlit fireplace. He didn't answer immediately. "I don't know what to think," he finally said. "I know you are different. But the public, the press, they want a show. They expect you to act like a trophy wife. They want you to flash jewelry and talk about vacations. If you don't do that, they call you boring. If you do, they call you greedy. So I lose either way," Sophie said. "I just want you to be prepared," Alexander said, draining his glass. "Rebecca can be cruel. She might try to test you. Don't let it get to you." He walked past her then, heading toward his study without another word. The automatic lock clicked shut on his study door, a solid, final sound that signaled he was done with the conversation. Sophie stood alone in the middle of the huge room again. She felt a lump form in her throat, but she refused to cry. Crying wouldn't fix anything. She felt invisible. She felt like a decoration in this beautiful, cold room. She turned away from the study and looked toward the far corner of the living room. It was the darkest part of the room, away from the windows. There was a large, odd-shaped object sitting there, covered in a heavy white sheet. It looked like a ghost. Sophie had noticed it when she first moved in, but Alexander had never mentioned it, so she assumed it was just a piece of old furniture or a sculpture he didn't like. But today, drawn by a strange curiosity and a need to be close to something real, she walked toward it. As she got closer, she realized what the shape was. She knew that curve. She knew the silhouette of the legs sticking out from the bottom of the sheet. It was a piano. Her heart beat a little faster. Sophie hadn't played since she moved into the penthouse. She felt like her music didn't belong here, just like she didn't belong here. But looking at the shape under the sheet, she felt a pull. Music was the only thing that had ever made sense to her. It was the only way she knew how to speak when she didn't have the words. She reached the covered object and hesitated. Alexander had said he wanted her to be on her best behavior tomorrow. He wanted her to impress his sister and the guests. How could she do that? She wasn't a socialite. She didn't know how to small talk about stocks and diamonds. Slowly, Sophie reached out and grabbed the corner of the heavy white sheet. The fabric was soft in her hand. She pulled it back. Dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight as the sheet slid away, revealing a black Steinway grand piano. It was magnificent. The black finish gleamed, reflecting the sunlight like a mirror. The ivory keys looked pristine, untouched. It was strange. In a house filled with expensive, modern furniture, this piano looked like it had a soul. It looked out of place, yet it felt more like home than anything else in the apartment. Sophie ran her fingers along the smooth wood of the lid. It was cool to the touch. Why was it covered? Why was such a beautiful instrument hidden away in the dark? She remembered a magazine article she had read years ago, before she even met Alexander. It mentioned that his mother was a famous pianist. She had died when Alexander was very young. Sophie looked at the piano again, and suddenly, it made sense. This wasn't just an instrument. This was a memory. It was a ghost that Alexander wasn't ready to face. He had locked it away, just like he had locked away his ability to trust. He lived in this open, glass house, but he kept the most important parts of himself covered up and hidden in the dark. Sophie sat down on the bench. It creaked slightly under her weight. She placed her hands on the keys, but she didn't press them down yet. She just sat there, feeling the texture of the ivory against her fingertips. The gala was tomorrow. She would have to walk into that room full of sharks, with cameras flashing and people whispering behind their hands. They would look at her dress, her hair, her shoes. They would judge her. Rebecca would test her. Alexander would be watching, waiting to see if she was worthy. Sophie took a deep breath. She couldn't fight their money with more money. She couldn't fight their gossip with gossip. The only weapon she had was herself. The only thing she had that was real was the music. She lifted her hands. She didn't play yet. She just held the position, closing her eyes. She imagined the silence leaving the room. She imagined filling this cold, glass box with something warm. Something alive. For the first time in 3 weeks, Sophie didn't feel like an intruder. She felt like a musician who had found her instrument again. She wasn't the billionaire's new wife anymore. She wasn't the gold digger on the front page of the newspaper. She was just Sophie. And she was sitting at a piano that had been waiting for someone to listen to it. The city hummed far below them, indifferent and busy. But up here, in the quiet corner of the penthouse, a story was about to begin. It wasn't a story about money. It was a story about finding a voice in the silence. The ballroom was crowded, filled with the scent of expensive perfume, fresh lilies, and the faint smell of beeswax from the polished floor. It was beautiful, in a way that made Sophie feel small. Huge crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting sparkling light over the guests. Everywhere she looked, there were diamonds, silk, and perfectly styled hair. Sophie stood near a tall pillar, clutching her glass of sparkling water. She was wearing the gown Alexander had bought for her, a floor-length dress of deep emerald green silk. It fit perfectly, hugging her waist and flowing down to the floor. When she looked in the mirror earlier, she had barely recognized herself. She looked like a movie star. But she didn't feel like one. She felt like a child playing a dangerous game. Alexander was across the room, surrounded by men in dark suits. He was talking intensely, his hands moving as he explained a business graph on a tablet. Every now and then, he would glance over at her. He wasn't smiling. He looked worried. Sophie knew he was waiting to see if she would mess up. The pressure was heavy on her shoulders. "Well, you certainly scrubbed up nicely." The voice was sharp, cutting through the low hum of conversation like a knife. Sophie turned around and saw a tall woman with icy blonde hair standing there. It was Rebecca, Alexander's sister. She was holding a glass of wine and her eyes were scanning Sophie from head to toe, looking for a flaw. "Thank you, Rebecca," Sophie said, trying to keep her voice steady. "The dress is beautiful." Rebecca took a slow sip of her drink. "It's a Vera Wang original." It costs more than most people make in a year. You have a knack for finding expensive things, don't you, or does Alexander just hand you the credit card? Sophie felt a hot flush rise up her neck. This was the attack she knew was coming. Alexander has been very generous, she said carefully. But I chose the dress because of the color. Green is my favorite. Rebecca let out a short, dry laugh. Your favorite? Right. Let's drop the act, shall we? We both know why you are here. I've read the tabloids. I've seen the way you look at him. You're bored, and you're ambitious. I get it. But don't think for a second that you can fool me. It's not an act, Sophie said, her voice shaking a little. I care about him. Save it for someone who buys it, Rebecca snapped, stepping closer. You're a teacher. Or you were. What could you possibly have in common with a man like him? You can't talk about his business. You don't know about his world. You are just a prop on his arm. Once the novelty wears off, he will get bored. And then, where will you go? Sophie looked down at her glass. She wanted to run away. She wanted to leave this room full of judgmental eyes and go back to her small apartment where life was simple. But she stood her ground. I am here because I love him, she whispered. Rebecca rolled her eyes and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Sophie let out a long breath she felt like she had been holding for hours. She felt a tear stinging her eye, but she blinked it away. Crying would only prove Rebecca right. She walked slowly toward the edge of the room. She needed a break from the staring and the whispering. She ended up near the orchestra, which was setting up on a small stage. The musicians were tuning their instruments, the screech of a violin, the low hum of a cello. It was a sound Sophie knew well. It felt familiar and safe. She watched a man in a tuxedo walk onto the stage. It was the conductor, a friend of Alexander's. He was talking to a cellist, but he glanced over at Sophie. He sneered a little, recognizing her as the new wife from the papers. It's a shame, she heard him say to the cellist, loud enough for her to hear. Alexander used to have such refined taste in art. Now he marries a woman who probably thinks the orchestra is just background noise for her shopping spree. The cellist looked awkward and didn't reply, but the conductor's words hit Sophie hard. It wasn't just Rebecca. Everyone thought she was shallow. They thought she was a gold digger who only cared about money and status. None of them knew she had spent her entire life saving to buy sheet music. None of them knew she had played in empty churches just to hear the acoustics. The orchestra began to play a soft classical piece to start the evening. It was beautiful, but Sophie felt like she was listening to it from behind a thick pane of glass. She was separated from it. The music was for them, the wealthy, the refined, the real members of this society. She was just an outsider wearing a fancy costume. Suddenly, Alexander was at her side. He looked tense. You okay? He asked, looking around the room. I saw Rebecca talking to you. She's very direct, Sophie said, not wanting to cause a fight. She's protective, Alexander corrected. Did she say anything terrible? Just the usual, Sophie lied. She likes the dress. Alexander relaxed a little. Good. Look, I have to go talk to some investors. Just try to blend in. Talk to people. Drink some champagne. Smile. He gave her a pat on the arm and walked away again. Blend in. Smile. It felt like an order. Sophie felt a wave of loneliness wash over her. She was surrounded by hundreds of people, yet she had never felt more alone in her life. She wandered through the crowd, nodding politely at people who ignored her. She stood by a table of hors d'oeuvres, watching the waiters carry silver trays. She felt invisible, or worse, visible only as a target. "She's pretty, isn't she heard a woman whisper nearby. "But look at her shoes. Last season's collection. She doesn't quite fit the part yet." "Give it time," a man replied. "She'll learn the spending habits soon enough." Sophie turned her back to them. She couldn't listen to any more. Her heart ached with a sharp pain. These people didn't see her. They saw a label. A stereotype. Her eyes drifted back to the orchestra. The conductor was waving his arms dramatically, enjoying the spotlight. Sophie closed her eyes for a moment, imagining the notes he was conducting. It was a complex piece, full of emotion. If she were playing it, she would slow down the tempo, let the notes breathe more. "You look like you're solving a math problem in your head," a voice said. Sophie opened her eyes. It was a young waiter, maybe 20 years old, holding a tray of drinks. He looked kind. "Just thinking," Sophie said. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere but here," the boy said with a shy smile. "I feel that way too, sometimes. But the tips are good." Sophie smiled back, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "You have no idea how much I'd rather be anywhere else." "Can I get you a refill?" he asked, nodding to her empty glass. "No, thank you," she said. "I think I've had enough of pretending." The boy walked away, and Sophie watched him go. At least he was honest about being here for the money. She was the one everyone suspected, yet she was the only one not getting paid to be there. She looked back at the stage. The music swelled, loud and triumphant. To the crowd, this was just background noise. It was something to fill the silence while they drank and gossiped. But to Sophie, it was everything. It was the language she spoke fluently, better than English. It was the only thing that had never judged her. She stood there, listening to the violins weep and the cellos hum. She realized then that she couldn't fight these people with words. She couldn't argue with Rebecca. She couldn't convince the conductor she was smart. She felt a sudden, burning desire to show them. Not with words, but with something they couldn't ignore. Sophie looked across the room at Alexander. He was laughing at a joke one of the investors made, but his eyes looked tired. He was still hiding. He was still acting the part of the cold billionaire. And she was playing the part of the trophy wife. But the music was real. The feeling in her chest was real. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she would stop trying to fit into their world. Tomorrow, she would show them a piece of hers. She would play the piano she had found. She would bring the music that Alexander had locked away back into the light. She took a deep breath, smoothing the green silk of her dress. The night wasn't over yet, but the battle lines were drawn. They thought she was empty. They thought she was just a pretty face with a greedy heart. Sophie turned away from the orchestra. She stood up straight. She might be an outsider tonight, but she knew something they didn't. She knew that underneath the silence and the money, there was a heart beating in that house. And she was going to wake it up. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains, but it did little to warm the atmosphere in the penthouse. Sophie woke up to the sound of silence, which was usually how the days started here. Alexander was already gone. A note on the kitchen counter explained that he had gone to the office early and wouldn't be back until late. She poured herself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, looking down at the city. The events of the previous night played over and over in her mind like a bad movie she couldn't turn off. Rebecca's cold voice, the conductor's sneer, the feeling of being invisible in a room full of people. It was exhausting. Sophie put the cup down on the marble counter with a clink. She couldn't just sit here and wait for the next event. She couldn't just be a decoration. She walked out of the kitchen and into the vast living room. The sun was hitting the far corner now, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. Her eyes were drawn immediately to the sheet-covered shape in the corner. The piano. Yesterday, she had only uncovered it for a moment. Today, she felt a stronger pull. It was like the instrument was calling to her, begging to be freed from the darkness. Sophie walked over to the hallway closet and opened it. Inside, neatly organized on shelves, were cleaning supplies. She took out a soft duster made of ostrich feathers and a bottle of wood polish. She also grabbed a step stool from the utility room. She walked back to the piano and set up the stool. For the next hour, Sophie worked. She didn't feel like a wife of a billionaire then. She felt like the girl she used to be, scrubbing floors and working hard to make things shine. She climbed up and carefully dusted the top of the instrument, removing the layer of gray that had settled there. She polished the mahogany legs until they gleamed like dark mirrors. When she was finished, she stepped back and took a deep breath. It was time. She grasped the edge of the heavy white sheet. It felt heavy in her hands, like a physical weight of the past. She pulled. The fabric slid off the black surface and fell to the floor in a heap. The piano stood there, exposed to the sunlight. It was majestic. The black lacquer reflected the room perfectly. It looked brand new, yet it carried a sense of age and history. It didn't belong in this modern, cold penthouse. It looked like it belonged in an old-world manor, filled with books and fireplaces. Just then, the silence was broken by a loud crash. Sophie jumped, spinning around. The sound had come from Alexander's study. It was the sound of a phone being slammed onto a desk, or perhaps a book thrown against a wall. Then came the shouting. "I don't care about the cost. Fix it." Alexander's voice was muffled by the glass walls of his study, but the anger was clear. Sophie stood frozen by the piano. She hadn't realized he was home. She had thought he was miles away in his office tower. A moment later, the study door slid open with a swish. Alexander stormed out. He was loosening his tie, his face red and his breathing heavy. He looked like a man who was fighting a war and losing. "I told them the projection was wrong, but would they listen?" he muttered to himself, running a hand through his dark hair. "No, now the whole deal is collapsing." He walked a few steps into the living room, his eyes on the floor. He didn't see Sophie at first. He was too lost in his own frustration. Then, he stopped. He saw the sheet on the floor. Then he looked up and saw the piano. His face went from red to pale white in a second. Sophie flinched at the tone. She quickly bent down and scooped up the sheet. "I'm sorry, Alexander. I was just cleaning. It looked so lonely under there." He walked closer, his eyes never leaving the instrument. "You cleaned it? Why?" "Because it's beautiful," Sophie said simply. "Because it shouldn't be hidden." Alexander reached the piano and put his hand on the lid. He didn't open it. He just rested his hand there, his fingers trembling slightly. "This isn't just a piece of furniture, Sophie. It's a reminder." "Of what?" Sophie asked softly, stepping a little closer. "Of my mother," he said. His voice was quieter now, less angry, but filled with a deep sadness. She died when I was 7. This was hers. She played every day. The house was always full of music, laughter, life. When she got sick, the music stopped. When she died, my father couldn't bear to look at it. He covered it up. And when he died, and I inherited this place, I just left it. He turned to look at her. Every time I walk past it, I feel guilty. I feel like I failed them. I failed to keep the music alive. So I covered it up. It's easier to pretend it doesn't exist. Sophie looked at the piano, then back at Alexander. She saw the cracks in his armor. He wasn't just a cold businessman. He was a scared little boy who missed his mother. Maybe you didn't fail, Sophie said gently. Maybe you were just waiting for the right time to let it back in. The right time? Alexander let out a bitter laugh. There is no right time. The house is too quiet now. It's too big. Playing it would just sound sad. It would echo. Music isn't supposed to be perfect, Alexander, Sophie said. She walked past him and ran her hand along the keys. They were cool and smooth. And it's not supposed to be quiet. It's supposed to be felt. Even if it's sad, it's better than this emptiness. She lifted the heavy lid that covered the keys. It made a soft thud as it settled into place. Then she unfolded the music rack. The keys lay there, waiting. Black and white, a stark contrast to the gray and white room. Alexander watched her, his body tense. I don't want to hear it, Sophie. I really don't. Just listen to one note, she said. If you hate it, I will cover it back up right now. I promise. I will get the sheet and I will never touch it again. Alexander hesitated. He looked at the keys, then at Sophie's pleading face. He saw no greed there. No trickery. He just saw a woman offering him something he hadn't had in a long time. Comfort. Fine, he whispered. One note. Sophie sat down on the bench. It felt firm and supportive. She took a deep breath, centering herself. She could feel Alexander standing right behind her. She could feel his anxiety radiating off him like heat. He was expecting pain. He was expecting the memories to hurt. She didn't want to hurt him. She wanted to heal him. Sophie placed her right hand on the keys. She didn't press down immediately. She found the note a middle C. It was a simple note, the heart of the piano. She took a breath and pressed the key. The sound rang out. It wasn't perfectly tuned, it had been sitting for years, after all, but the tone was rich and deep. It resonated through the wooden body of the piano and filled the air. It wasn't a jarring sound. It was warm. It was a voice speaking after a long sleep. The note hung in the air, echoing slightly against the high ceiling, just like Alexander had feared. But it wasn't a sad echo. It sounded like a sigh of relief. Sophie didn't play another note. She just let that single sound fade into silence until it was gone. She turned around on the bench to look at Alexander. He was standing perfectly still. His eyes were closed. He looked like he was holding his breath, afraid that if he breathed, the magic of the moment would break. Alexander, she whispered. He opened his eyes slowly. There was a sheen of tears in them, but he blinked them away. It's out of tune, he said, his voice raspy. A little bit, Sophie agreed. But the tone is good. It has a soul. Alexander stared at the piano. The tension in his shoulders seemed to drop an inch. He walked over and sat down on the bench next to her. He didn't touch the keys. He just sat there, looking at the row of ivory and ebony. "I haven't sat here since I was 6, he admitted softly. "My mother used to let me hit the keys while she practiced." Sophie shifted over to give him more space. "Do you remember any songs?" He shook his head. "No, I remember the feeling. I remember feeling safe." She looked at him. "You know, my mother used to tell me something when I was scared to play in front of people." "What?" "She said that when you play music, you aren't alone. You are sharing a piece of your heart with the room. And if you let the music out, the room can't be empty anymore." Alexander looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time that day. He saw the kindness in her eyes. He realized that this wasn't about the piano anymore. It was about them. It was about breaking the silence that had ruled both of their lives. He reached out and placed his hand over hers, where it rested on her lap. "I'm sorry about last night," he said quietly. "I know Rebecca was hard on you. I know everyone talks." "It doesn't matter," Sophie said. "It does matter," he insisted. "I've been so focused on protecting myself from getting hurt again that I let you get hurt in the crossfire. I didn't even ask you what you wanted. I didn't even ask what you liked." "I like this," Sophie said, nodding toward the piano. "And I think I can help you remember how to like it again." She squeezed his hand. "I want to play something for you." "Not now." Maybe later when you're ready." Alexander looked back at the keys. The fear was still there, lurking in the back of his mind, but it was smaller now. It was overshadowed by a tiny spark of curiosity. He thought about the cold, empty future he had been picturing for himself, just business and loneliness. And then he looked at Sophie, who had brought a broom and a duster into his life and swept away the dust. "Okay," Alexander said, the word barely audible. "Maybe later." Sophie smiled. It was a genuine smile that made her whole face light up. She stood up from the bench. "I'll go make us some lunch. Actual food. Not the fancy stuff the chef makes." She walked toward the kitchen, leaving Alexander sitting at the piano. He stayed there for a long time after she left. He stared at the keys. Finally, tentatively, he reached out with one finger and pressed a key. A low E note rumbled through the floorboards. It was small. But it was a start. The silence in the penthouse had been broken. The afternoon sun faded into a soft, dusky twilight, casting long purple shadows across the living room floor. Alexander had eaten a simple lunch of soup and bread at the small kitchen island, a far cry from the formal dinners he was used to. It felt strange, but good. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of strangers, it was a comfortable quiet, the kind that happens when two people are tired but content. Alexander stood by the window again, looking out at the city lights flickering on one by one. He looked tired, but his shoulders weren't pulled up as tight as they usually were. "It's getting late," he said softly, turning to look at her. "I should probably check my emails." Sophie looked at him, then at the piano sitting in the corner, now uncovered and gleaming in the dim light. She knew he was stalling. He was afraid of what would happen if the music started again. "You can check your emails later," Sophie said. She walked over to the piano bench and sat down. "Come here for a minute." Alexander hesitated. He looked toward the safety of his study, where the business numbers made sense. But then he looked at Sophie. Her eyes were gentle, inviting him to step into the unknown. He let out a breath and walked over. He didn't sit down. He stood near the curve of the piano, his hands in his pockets, looking like a guest in his own home. "What are you going to play?" he asked. "Something for your mother," Sophie said. "And for you." She placed her hands on the keys. She flexed her fingers, feeling the coldness of the ivory. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment to gather her thoughts. She pushed away the memory of Rebecca's insults and the conductor's sneer. She pushed away the fear of being judged. She focused only on the feeling in her heart, the longing to bring peace to this house. She began to play. It was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The first few notes were soft and slow, like a gentle wave lapping against the shore. The piano, which had been silent for decades, seemed to wake up with a groan before settling into a rich, warm tone. The sound wasn't perfect, there was a slight buzz in the upper strings, but it was beautiful. It had character. Sophie played with a delicate touch. She wasn't showing off. She was telling a story. Her fingers moved across the keys with a grace that seemed effortless. The melody floated through the air, wrapping around the furniture and filling the empty spaces of the room. Alexander closed his eyes. The reaction was immediate. It hit him in the chest. Suddenly, he wasn't in a modern penthouse in the 21st century. He was transported back in time. He was a small boy again, sitting on a fluffy rug in a cozy living room. The smell of lavender and old books filled his nose. He saw his mother, her back straight, her fingers dancing over these exact keys. He remembered the safety he felt when she played. The world outside could be chaotic, but while the music played, everything was okay. He felt a lump form in his throat, hard and painful. He had spent 20 years running from this memory because it hurt too much. He thought if he forgot the music, he would forget the pain of losing her. But listening to Sophie, he realized he was wrong. Forgetting the music meant forgetting the love. Tears pricked at his eyelids. One escaped, sliding down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just let it fall. Sophie didn't look at him. She kept her eyes half closed, focused on the music. She put her own sorrow into the notes. She poured in the loneliness of being misunderstood, the ache of missing her own parents, and the deep desire she had to connect with Alexander. She played for every person who had ever been labeled not good enough. The music swelled, rising and falling like a chest breathing. She played the climax of the piece, where the notes became faster and more urgent, full of emotion. Then, slowly, she brought it back down. The music became soft again, whispery and gentle. She played the final chords, letting them linger in the air, savoring the vibration before fading into complete silence. Sophie lowered her hands to her lap. The piano held the sound for a moment longer before the room went quiet. But it wasn't the same silence as before. The room didn't feel empty or cold anymore. It felt full. It felt like the air was shimmering with energy. It felt like a ghost had been laid to rest and a memory had been turned into a blessing. Sophie sat there, waiting. She was nervous. She didn't know if he would be angry or if he would retreat. She heard a soft sniff behind her. She turned around on the bench. Alexander was standing there, crying openly now. He wasn't the stoic billionaire anymore. He looked broken, but in a way that meant he could finally be put back together. He looked at Sophie, his eyes red and wet. "How did you know?" he choked out. His voice was barely a whisper. "How did you know that was her favorite?" Sophie smiled sadly. "I didn't. Not for sure. But when I looked at the sheet, and I looked at this room, it felt like the right song. It's a song of peace. I thought you needed peace. Alexander reached out and gripped the edge of the piano lid to steady himself. I haven't heard that since I was 7 years old. I thought I had forgotten it. But it was all still there. He looked at Sophie with an expression she had never seen before. It wasn't suspicion. It wasn't polite indifference. It was gratitude. And respect. You are incredible, he said. The things they say about you, the things Rebecca said, they are so wrong. They don't know me, Sophie said simply. I didn't know you, Alexander admitted. I was so busy worrying about what you wanted from me that I didn't see what you had to give. I'm sorry, Sophie. Truly. The apology hung in the air, heavier and more important than the music had been. Just then, a sound came from the hallway. The soft beep of the front door keypad. The main entrance slid open. Rebecca walked in. She was holding a leather folder, presumably documents Alexander had asked for. She was dressed in her usual sharp business suit, her expression annoyed, likely about having to come over on a Sunday. Alexander, I have those papers you. Rebecca stopped dead in her tracks. She was standing just inside the entryway. She heard the silence that usually filled the room, but she felt something else. She saw the piano. It was uncovered. The sheet was gone. The lid was open, and she saw her brother crying. Rebecca's cold, confident mask slipped. She looked from the piano to Alexander, and then to Sophie, who was sitting on the bench. Rebecca's face went pale. I didn't mean to interrupt, Rebecca stammered. Her voice lost its sharp edge. Is everything okay? Alexander wiped his face with the back of his hand, turning to face his sister. He didn't try to hide his tears. He took a deep breath. Everything is fine, Rebecca, he said. His voice was stronger now. Sophie was just playing. She played Mom's song. Rebecca's eyes widened. She looked at the piano as if it were a ghost that had suddenly materialized. She walked slowly into the room, her heels clicking on the marble. She stopped a few feet away from the piano. She played, Rebecca asked, looking at Sophie. You know how to play? I teach, Sophie said softly. She stood up, feeling a bit self-conscious with the sister-in-law watching. I hope you don't mind. I know it was covered up. Rebecca stared at the keys. For a moment, Sophie thought she was going to yell. But then, Rebecca's face softened. The hard lines around her mouth relaxed. She looked younger suddenly, less like a shark and more like a little girl who missed her mother. I haven't heard that song in 20 years, Rebecca whispered. She looked at Alexander. I forgot what the house sounded like when music was in it. I forgot how beautiful it was. I know, Alexander said. Me too. Rebecca turned her gaze to Sophie. The judgment was gone. It was replaced by a look of genuine curiosity. You play beautifully, Rebecca said. I never knew Alexander mentioned it, he never told me you played. I didn't want to impose, Sophie said. Rebecca let out a small, incredulous laugh. Imposing? You brought my brother to tears in 10 minutes. I've been trying to get him to feel something for years. Alexander walked over and put a hand on Sophie's shoulder. It was a protective gesture, a claim of unity. Sophie didn't do it to manipulate me, Rebecca. She did it because she saw I was hurting. She saw this old piece of junk as something precious. Rebecca nodded slowly. She looked at the leather folder in her hand, then set it down on a side table. The business could wait. I misjudged you, Rebecca said directly to Sophie. I thought you were just, well, it doesn't matter what I thought. I was wrong. Sophie felt a weight lift off her shoulders that she hadn't realized was there. She smiled at Rebecca. I just wanted to make this place feel like a home. The three of them stood there for a moment, the grand piano standing like a sentinel between them. The sun had completely set now, and the city lights glowed through the glass walls. The room felt different. The cold perfection was gone, replaced by the warmth of shared humanity. Alexander sat down on the bench. He looked at the keys, then up at Sophie. I don't remember how to play, he said. I don't even know where to put my fingers. It's like riding a bike, Sophie said gently. Your hands remember even if your brain doesn't. She moved over on the bench to make room. Come here. Sit next to me. Alexander looked surprised. Now. Why not? Sophie said. Let's try a simple chord. Just one. Rebecca walked closer, leaning against the piano, watching with a faint smile on her face. Alexander sat down next to Sophie. Their hips touched. He felt her warmth, grounding him. Sophie reached out and guided his hand. Put your thumb here, on this C. And your pinky here, on this G. Alexander placed his fingers down awkwardly. Like this. Yes, Sophie said. Now press down together. Alexander took a breath. He pressed the keys. A chord rang out clear and strong. It wasn't a song. It was just a sound. But it was a sound they had made together. Sophie played a few melody notes that fit with his chord. It was a simple, halting duet. It wasn't a performance for a gala. It wasn't perfect. But as they sat there, husband and wife, playing a few notes while his sister watched, the music was the most beautiful thing in the world. It was the sound of walls coming down. It was the sound of a family beginning. The days that followed that quiet Sunday afternoon felt different in the penthouse. It wasn't a sudden, magical change where everything became perfect. The furniture was still modern and cold, the views were still high and dizzying, and the bills were still enormous. But the atmosphere had shifted. It was as if someone had opened a window in a stuffy room, letting in a fresh breeze. Sophie woke up one morning to the smell of coffee. She walked into the kitchen to find Alexander standing there. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing jeans and a simple sweater. He looked younger, less like a statue and more like a man. Good morning, he said, handing her a mug. It was a simple gesture, but the warmth in his voice made Sophie smile. Good morning, she replied. You're up early. I couldn't sleep, Alexander admitted, leaning against the counter. I kept hearing that chord we played yesterday. It got stuck in my head. Sophie took a sip of her coffee. Music has a way of doing that. Teach me, Alexander said suddenly. Sophie looked at him, surprised. Teach you, you mean, really play? Yes, he nodded. Not just hitting keys randomly. I want to learn. I have this beautiful instrument in the living room, and my wife is a teacher. It makes sense, doesn't it? Sophie's heart swelled. I would love that. But you know, it takes patience. It's not like business where you can just sign a contract and get results. It takes time. Alexander smiled, a genuine, crooked smile that reached his eyes. I have time. I think I've wasted enough time running away from things. I want to build something now. That evening, after Alexander returned from work, they sat down at the piano together. It wasn't a formal lesson. It was just two people sitting side by side. Sophie showed him the scales. She showed him how to curve his fingers, how to sit up straight, how to breathe with the music. Alexander fumbled. His fingers were stiff from years of typing on keyboards and signing checks. He missed notes. He got frustrated when his left hand wouldn't do what his right hand was doing. "You're pressing too hard," Sophie said gently, covering his hand with hers. "Relax. Let the weight of your arm do the work. Trust the piano." "Trust is hard for me," Alexander muttered, looking at the keys. "I know," Sophie said softly. "But you have to start somewhere. Start with the piano." He took a deep breath, exhaled, and tried again. This time, the note rang out clear. He looked at Sophie, and for the first time, she saw pure pride in his eyes, not pride in money, but pride in learning something new. The real test, however, came the following weekend. It was the night of a small, intimate dinner party Alexander was hosting. It wasn't the huge gala from before, but it was still important. The guest list included board members, investors, and a few socialites. And, of course, Rebecca was there. Sophie dressed carefully, choosing a simple, elegant black dress. She wasn't trying to impress anyone with flashiness tonight. She just wanted to be herself. When they arrived at the venue, a private room in a high-end restaurant, the chatter was loud. The air smelled of rich food and expensive wine. As soon as they walked in, the room seemed to pause. Eyes turned toward them. Sophie felt the old familiar squeeze of anxiety in her chest. She remembered the whispers from the last event. She remembered the label of gold digger. Alexander sensed her tension. He stopped in the doorway and gently squeezed her hand. He didn't pull her along like a prop. He waited for her. "Just be you," he whispered. They walked into the room. Rebecca was the first to approach them. She looked stunning in a red dress, but her expression wasn't cold tonight. She walked right up to Sophie and kissed her on both cheeks. "Sophie, you look wonderful," Rebecca said loudly enough for the people nearby to hear. "I'm so glad you could make it." "Thank you, Rebecca," Sophie said, relaxing a fraction. "Alexander tells me you've been giving him lessons," Rebecca continued, looking at her brother with a smirk. "About time someone taught him some culture." A few people nearby overheard. They looked confused. Lessons culture. They knew Alexander as the king of finance, the man who knew numbers, not notes. The dinner went smoothly, but the atmosphere changed when the after-dinner drinks were being served. A small jazz trio was playing in the corner of the room. One of the investors, a man named Mr. Henderson, turned to Alexander. "Music is fine, Alexander," Henderson said, waving his hand dismissively toward the band. "But let's talk about the merger. We need to know if you're still committed to the aggressive expansion." Alexander took a sip of his wine. He looked at Sophie, then back at Henderson. "I am committed to the company, Paul. But I'm learning that there is more to life than aggressive expansion." The room went quiet. The investors looked at him in shock. This wasn't the ruthless billionaire they were used to dealing with. "Like what?" Henderson asked, raising an eyebrow. "Like balance," Alexander said. He stood up. "In fact, if you gentlemen and ladies will excuse me for a moment. There is something I want to share." Sophie's eyes widened. What was he doing? Alexander walked over to the small stage where the jazz trio was playing. He whispered something to the piano player, who looked surprised but nodded and slid off the bench. Alexander sat down. The room was dead silent. Everyone stared. Alexander Sterling, the man who never showed emotion, was sitting at a piano in public. He placed his hands on the keys. He looked nervous. His back was stiff. He looked out into the crowd and found Sophie's face. She smiled at him and gave him a small nod. Alexander took a breath. He started to play. He didn't play a complicated classical piece. He played the simple melody Sophie had taught him. It was a slow, sweet lullaby. He wasn't a virtuoso. He made mistakes. He missed a transition, and his timing was a little off. But he played with feeling. He played with his whole heart. The sound was gentle and unpretentious. It wasn't a performance for money or status. It was a gift. It was Alexander showing the world that he was more than a bank account. He was a human being who could create beauty. He finished the song and let the last note fade. He sat there for a second, then stood up. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, Rebecca started to clap. Slowly at first, then enthusiastically. Sophie clapped too, tears stinging her eyes. Then, the rest of the room began to applaud. It wasn't polite applause, it was genuine. Alexander walked back to the table, looking slightly flushed but happy. Henderson looked at him with new respect. "I didn't know you had that in you, Alexander," Henderson admitted. "I have a good teacher," Alexander said, putting his arm around Sophie's waist. "My wife reminded me that life isn't just about what you own. It's about what you feel." Later that night, when they returned to the penthouse, the silence was gone for good. The house felt warm. It felt like a home. Alexander didn't go straight to his study. He took off his jacket and tie and walked straight to the piano. Sophie followed him. "Play with me?" he asked. "Always," Sophie answered. They sat down together. This time, Alexander didn't need her to guide his fingers. He knew what to do. He played the bass notes, a simple rhythm. Sophie played the melody above it, weaving a complex tapestry of sound that harmonized perfectly. They weren't just playing music. They were communicating without words. The Gold Digger label was gone, destroyed not by arguments, but by the truth of their connection. The people who judged them didn't matter anymore. The tabloids could write what they wanted. In this glass tower high above the city, two people had found each other. They had found a way to heal old wounds with melody. They played until their fingers were tired, filling the empty spaces of their lives with love, one note at a time. And as the final chord of the night rang out, lingering in the air like a promise, Sophie knew that this was real. This was true. And this was only the beginning of their song.